Complete silence fell over the courtroom. There was not a whisper, not a breath, not even the faint scratch of a pen on paper. Judge Robin Tarnowski had just played an audio recording that no one expected, especially not Sean Diddy Combs himself. The music mogul's face went pale as his own voice boomed through the speakers, saying things so shocking that several jurors physically jumped back in their seats. If you're new to our channel, please like and subscribe for more updates on high-profile cases. We bring you clear, accurate coverage of stories that matter. Nobody thought this moment would come today. The room was already tense during what should have been a routine discussion about which recordings would count as evidence. All eyes were on the lawyers speaking until the judge suddenly said, "I've looked at this evidence in my chambers and believe the jury needs to hear it in full." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Even the court reporter paused. There was no warning, no lead-in, just Judge Tarnowski telling the technician to play Exhibit 24B over the courtroom speakers. Up until then, Diddy had stayed calm throughout the trial, looking confident despite the serious charges he faced. But things shifted. Maybe it was realizing that the recording even existed. Maybe it was the shock of hearing the judge declare it admissible. Maybe it was knowing that his own words were about to contradict everything his defense had argued for weeks. Whatever it was, Diddy's carefully built mask slipped. He wasn't in the room as a famous star anymore. He was there as a defendant, hearing his unguarded words, a man watching his freedom slip away with every syllable. And when the recording started, nobody in the courtroom was ready for what came next. What Diddy said in that private conversation about how he treated women, how his alleged criminal network worked, and how he believed he was untouchable was more than just bad evidence. It was a confession that no defense team, no matter how skilled, could explain away. It began like any other day of the trial. The room was alive with quiet conversations. Reporters leaned forward in their seats and lawyers whispered your strategies as they waited for the judge to enter and start the day's work. But when Judge Tarnowski walked in with a serious look and called both legal teams to the front, everything changed. You could hear a pin drop. Some thought it was a routine procedure. Others guessed maybe a juror had reported misconduct. But when the prosecutors and defense attorneys straightened up and listened carefully to the judge, nodding with growing seriousness, everyone knew something big was happening. The judge raised her hand to quiet the murmurs in the gallery. Diddy, who had been casually looking over papers with his team, looked up too, sensing the shift. At first, his face didn't go pale. That came later, but his eyes narrowed as he noticed something was wrong. Judge Tarnowski sat down and spoke to the courtroom without looking at anyone. She did not even glance at Diddy, who was now sitting up straight, his usual casual attitude replaced by alertness. During the discovery process, the prosecution had given several audio recordings to the court. Judge Tarnowski said she had reviewed everything and decided that one recording, Exhibit 24B, was both relevant and allowed under federal evidence rules, even though the defense said it shouldn't be used. She made it clear that the recording would be played for the jury. From that moment, the trial shifted because what was about to play wasn't some rumor or second-hand story. It was Diddy's own voice in a conversation he thought was private. Diddy's lead attorney immediately stood up. The attorney said the defense objected again. They argued the recording was made without Diddy's knowledge or consent, and they worried it might be edited or tampered with. But Judge Tarnowski cut him off with a raised hand. She said the objections had already been discussed in her private chambers. She noted that 3 independent audio experts confirmed the recording was authentic and not altered. Her ruling stood. The jury would hear the recording in full. The courtroom was completely still as the technician prepared the sound system. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready. Diddy's family members exchanged worried looks. The prosecution team sat perfectly still, their faces unreadable. Diddy whispered urgently to his lawyer, who placed a steadying hand on Diddy's arm and shook his head slightly as if to say, "There's nothing to be done." Judge Tarnowski spoke directly to the jury. She reminded them that the recording was made on September 3rd, 2019 at a private home in Los Angeles. They would hear the voice of the defendant, Sean Combe, talking with another person whose name was known to the court. She asked them to consider this evidence along with all the testimony they had heard so far. Then she nodded to the technician and said, "Go ahead." The speakers crackled briefly, then Diddy's voice filled the courtroom, sounding relaxed and unguarded and about to change everything. The recording opened with casual talk, the clink of ice and glasses, music playing softly in the background. It was clearly a social setting. Diddy's voice was easygoing, laughing about something unimportant. The other man's voice, a bit deeper, replied in the same relaxed way. They talked about an industry event and a mutual friend, everyday topics that didn't hint at what would come next. But about 3 minutes in, the other man asked, "What about that situation with the girl from the party? Is that handled?" There was a pause and you could hear a drink being poured. Then Diddy's voice came back, a bit more cautious, but still sure of himself. He said it was taken care of because he had a system in place and paid people to make it work. The other man pressed, "But she was talking about going to the press." "That's different. Talking is different from doing," Diddy replied in a dismissive tone. "They all talk at first, then they remember how this town works. They remember who helps them get jobs and who can make sure they never work again. It's business." As the recording went on, Diddy became more detailed and explicit. He explained what he called his infrastructure, a network of employees, associates, and industry connections that handled these situations as they popped up. He said, "Look, you've been to the parties, you've seen how it works. Phones are checked at the door, NDAs are signed before anyone even gets in the car. We use the right substances to make people more flexible. It's not random, it's a system that works." The other man sounded uneasy now. He said, "But some of these girls seem really messed up. Remember when that one model ended up in the hospital? Who paid her medical bills?" Diddy shot back. "Who made sure there was no police report? Who got her a campaign with that French designer 3 months later? She's fine. They're all fine. They get what they want. I get what I want. Those who understand the game move up. Those who don't, well," in the courtroom, the jury listened with faces ranging from disgust to shock. Several jurors took copious notes. One older juror looked like she was fighting back tears. Diddy sat still, staring at the table, his attorney's hand on his shoulder, offering both restraint and support. The recording continued. Diddy described specific events that matched what witnesses had already said in court. From his perspective, the women weren't victims, they were willing participants in a deal that helped everyone. "The problem happens when they forget what they signed up for," he said. "When they forget who made them," he explained. "I take some nobody from nowhere, put her in the right rooms, get her the right contracts, and suddenly she thinks she made herself. She forgets who holds the power." The other voice objected, "But some of this crosses lines that girl didn't agree to." Before he could finish, Diddy cut him off. "She agreed the moment she took the first gift, the first trip, the first opportunity. That was the deal. Everything after that is just details." As the recording played on, Diddy spoke more about his methods of control, how he made sure people stayed silent if they forgot the rules. He named specific people who had already been mentioned in testimony, detailing incidents prosecutors had already laid out but now confirmed in Diddy's own words. The most damning part came about 15 minutes into the recording. Diddy spoke about consent directly. "Consent is a contract," he said, matter-of-factly, "and like any contract, it has terms. You give me certain things, I give you certain things. The problem isn't that anyone is forced. The problem is that some people want to renegotiate after they've already taken what I offered. That's not how it works." The other voice, sounding more and more uncomfortable, said, "But some of these girls say they were drugged. They couldn't even consent." There was a pause. You could hear a glass set down heavily. Then Diddy's voice came back, lower and edged with anger. "And who's going to believe them? Their word against mine, their word against an entire system built to protect me. I've spent decades making sure that can't happen. In the courtroom, a prosecutor closed her eyes briefly as if what she just heard was almost too much to believe. Diddy's lead attorney scribbled furiously, leaning over to whisper to his team preparing objections or damage control strategies. Judge Tarnowski watched the jury, noting their reactions. The recording went on. Diddy explained how allegations were handled, how potential witnesses were paid off or discredited, how evidence was controlled or destroyed. It's not about whether something happened, he said. It's about making sure there's no proof, no credible witness, no scenario where it's their word against mine, because I already win that fight before it starts. Near the end of the recording, the other voice asked one last question. Aren't you worried? With all the Me Too stuff, people are taking these accusations seriously now. Diddy laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the courtroom. That's for people without real power. I have senators in my contacts. I have police chiefs at my parties. I've built this network for 30 years. I'm not worried about some movement on Twitter. The recording closed with the sound of glasses clinking. Here's to being untouchable, Diddy's voice said, with no hint of doubt. When the audio stopped, the courtroom was utterly silent. It felt like someone had sucked all the air out of the room. Nobody moved. Finally, Judge Tarnowski broke the silence. The record will show Exhibit 24B was played in full for the jury. She then asked Diddy's attorney, does the defense wish to make a statement about this evidence? The attorney stood looking shaken despite his usual calm. Yes, Your Honor, we request a brief recess to confer with our client. The judge nodded. The court will recess for 30 minutes. Members of the jury, do not discuss this recording or any other evidence during the recess. As the jury left, many avoided looking at Diddy. The gallery burst into whispers the moment the judge stepped away from the bench. For the first time since the trial began, Diddy looked genuinely afraid. When court reconvened after the break, everything had changed. Diddy had composed himself a bit, but his confident air was gone. His legal team huddled around him, passing urgent notes. The prosecution team sat calmly, their case suddenly stronger than they could have hoped. Assistant U.S. Attorney Emily Johnson rose and waited for the judge to speak. Judge Tarnowski returned to the bench and addressed the court. She said she wanted to give context for the recording the jury had heard. She explained that a confidential informant had provided the recording to the prosecution and that it was made legally under California's one-party consent law. Since the informant was part of the conversation, she noted that the defense had challenged the recording in several ways, but the court had rejected every objection. Experts had confirmed it was authentic, and its value for the case far outweighed any possible prejudice, especially because it directly related to charges of racketeering and sex trafficking. Then she turned to the prosecution. The government may proceed with its next witness. Johnson stood and said that, in light of the recording, they called FBI Special Agent Marcus Rivera. Agent Rivera, a serious man in his late 40s with closely cropped hair and a sharp suit, took the stand and was sworn in. After he explained his background in investigating organized crime and human trafficking, the prosecutor got to the point. Agent Rivera, were you involved in the investigation that led to the recovery of the recording we just heard? She asked. Yes, Rivera replied. I was the case agent assigned to Mr. Combs' investigation starting in early 2020. Can you explain how this recording came into the FBI's hands? He was asked. In December 2019, an individual contacted the FBI with information about Mr. Combs' alleged crimes. This person, who had been close to Combs for years, was worried about things they had seen and done. After proving they were reliable, they agreed to become a confidential informant. Was this person the one who made the recording? The prosecutor asked. Yes, Rivera confirmed. After agreeing to help us, they told us about this recording, which they had made several months earlier to protect themselves in case Combs ever found out they were questioning him. They were afraid of retaliation. The prosecutor showed a document to the judge. Your Honor, I offer this FBI memorandum as Exhibit 25. The document was admitted. Johnson continued. Agent Rivera, what concerns did this informant raise in the initial interview? The informant described what they called a system run by Comb that identified, recruited, and exploited young women who wanted to enter the entertainment business. They talked about how Comb used drugs, threats, money, and blackmail to control them. They were especially worried about using date rape drugs at private parties and secretly filming compromising situations without consent. In the gallery, journalists typed furiously. Diddy's family looked stunned, some wiping away tears. Diddy himself sat rigid, his jaw clenched. Johnson asked, after receiving this recording, what did the FBI do to check if it was real? We sent it to our forensic audio lab, Rivera said. They confirmed 3 things. The recording wasn't edited or altered, the voices matched Comb and the informant, and the background noise and acoustics matched the location it was recorded at. And did this recording lead to further investigation? She asked. Yes, Rivera said. It was one part of a larger investigation, but it gave us specific leads. We interviewed people named on the recording, subpoenaed financial records mentioned, and questioned security personnel mentioned. It essentially provided a map to investigate the alleged criminal operation. Johnson displayed a chart on the courtroom screens. Agent Rivera, can you explain this organizational chart to the jury? Rivera pointed to the chart showing Comb at the top of a complex network of associates, employees, and helpers. Based on interviews and evidence, it showed how Comb ran a criminal enterprise. He directed everything at the top. Below him were trusted lieutenants who carried out his orders and kept him shielded from the most explicit crimes. Then there were security personnel who controlled access and stopped victims from leaving, medical professionals who provided prescription drugs, fixers who handled payoffs and threats, lawyers who wrote NDAs and settlement agreements, and at the bottom, the victims themselves. Rivera explained that the organization was very compartmentalized. Many people only knew their specific jobs, not the full scope of the operation. This is common in organized crime, so that only the leader fully understands how everything works. As Rivera spoke, he connected statements from the recording to evidence gathered in the investigation. He cited financial records showing payments to women who had accused abuse but then changed their stories. He mentioned text messages instructing security to stop specific individuals from leaving events. He showed medical records of women hospitalized after Diddy's parties, and the most devastating testimony came when Rivera said how the recording matched victim statements that the defense had previously called uncorroborated. One victim testified that Comb told her consent is a contract when she objected to sexual activities in 2018. The defense said she invented that phrase, but now the jury heard Comb say that exact phrase in the recording, proving it was his own terminology. Throughout this, Diddy grew more agitated. He whispered urgently to his attorneys, who struggled to calm him. When Rivera began linking specific recording statements to victims' testimony, Diddy suddenly stood up. "This is all lies," he shouted before his attorneys could stop him. "That recording is taken completely out of context." Judge Tarnowski banged her gavel. "Mr. Comb, sit down immediately. You may not speak in this court except through your attorneys or if you testify." Security officers moved closer to the defense table. Diddy's lead attorney placed a hand on his arm. "Sean, please, this isn't helping." Diddy slowly sat down, the damage already done. The jury saw his outburst and their faces showed disappointment to disgust. Judge Tarnowski addressed the jury. "Disregard the defendant's outburst. It is not evidence." But the jurors' expressions suggested they had been deeply affected by the recording, Rivera's testimony, and Diddy's reaction. As testimony continued, the prosecution connected the dots between the recording, the FBI investigation, and multiple victim statements. They painted a clear picture of a criminal enterprise built to exploit vulnerable women for decades. By the time Agent Rivera left the stand, the defense's claim that the allegations were made up for money was in ruins. Diddy's own words confirmed the prosecution's argument. This was not about isolated incidents or misunderstandings, but a systematic operation to facilitate abuse and keep victims silent. After Rivera's testimony, the prosecution called Dr. Eliza Montgomery, an expert in trauma psychology and coercive control. Dr. Montgomery, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a clear, direct way of speaking, took the stand confidently. She had testified many times before. After the prosecutor asked about her credentials, decades of work with trafficking and abuse victims, the prosecutor asked her to explain the importance of the recording in terms of coercive control. What we heard in that recording, Dr. Montgomery said, was a textbook example of a control system. Mr. Combe described multiple methods to keep compliance and silence, financial control, career opportunities, threats of blacklisting, surveillance, secret recordings, NDAs, and using substances to lower resistance. This is not random or opportunistic. It's a sophisticated system meant to create victims who cannot escape or speak out, she went on. When Combe said consent is a contract and talked about making people and having the power to break them, he was describing the core of coercive control. He creates a situation where victims feel they have no choice but to comply. Dr. Montgomery explained how these systems usually work. She used examples from the recording and previous testimony to show each step. She said that at first, recruits get real opportunities and benefits, making them feel grateful and dependent. Young people trying to break into the entertainment industry receive gifts, connections, and promises of success. This creates both gratitude and reliance. Then boundaries are pushed slowly. The first compromising situation might seem like a misunderstanding. By the time victims understand what's really happening, they are already in too deep, trapped by fear and shame. The prosecutor showed text messages from alleged victims entered into evidence earlier. Dr. Montgomery, how would you describe these messages? She asked. After reading messages where women declined invitations or expressed discomfort and then got threatening replies, Dr. Montgomery said these show intermittent reinforcement, mixing reward with punishment, praise with threat. This creates a strong psychological dependency. Victims focus on pleasing the controller to avoid punishment. She pointed to specific lines, how quickly the tone shifts from "you're so special to me" to "after everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me," and then to direct threats about career fallout. This back and forth is confusing and makes it hard for victims to set boundaries. The prosecutor asked about the substances mentioned in the recording. Dr. Montgomery said, using alcohol and drugs, especially without full consent, is a common trafficking and exploitation tactic. It reduces resistance, creates memory gaps, allows for plausible deniability, and often makes victims blame themselves for what happened. She added, when Mr. Combe talked about using the right substances to make people more flexible, he was describing a strategy to break down true consent, which must be freely given by someone able to choose. Through Dr. Montgomery's testimony, clinical language showed how behaviors mentioned throughout the trial fit into a single system of control. What looked like isolated incidents or unclear events became pieces of a larger pattern of exploitation. The prosecutor then asked about how victims are affected psychologically. Dr. Montgomery explained that such control systems cause deep trauma. Victims may not come forward for years, even decades. When someone has endured this kind of systematic control by a powerful, wealthy person with many connections, the fear of speaking up is completely reasonable. Victims see again and again that resistance leads to consequences. and they know the system protects the abuser, not them. She explained how this was connected to the recording they had heard when Mr. Holmes said, "Who is going to believe them?" Their word against mine. He was saying exactly why these systems keep going. Victims know this truth. They have seen others try to speak out and get destroyed for it. Carrying such experiences without anyone believing you or seeing justice is a huge burden on the mind. Throughout this testimony, Diddy sat completely still. His earlier outburst had either used all his energy or been held back by his lawyers warning him. His attorneys took many notes, but seemed to find it hard to question an expert whose analysis matched their client's own recorded words so well. When cross-examination finally began, the defense attorney was careful. He asked general questions about how reliable memory is and whether some relationships with big power imbalances can still be consented to. Dr. Montgomery admitted these issues were complex but kept coming back to the exact words from the recording. When someone clearly explains using drugs to make people more flexible, stopping them from leaving events, and using job opportunities as both a reward and a threat, we are no longer talking about unclear power differences or consensual relationships. We are talking about a planned way to destroy true consent. By the time Dr. Montgomery left the witness stand, her testimony had given the jury a clear framework for understanding both the recording and earlier victim statements. What the defense tried to say were simple mistakes or choices people regretted, or business deals became clear as parts of a complex system of control and abuse. In the gallery, several alleged victims who had already testified were clearly emotional. Some held hands or hugged as they finally heard an expert explain the things they had struggled to put into words. Reporters took notes quickly, already thinking of headlines about Diddy's system of control and how he kept everyone silent. As the day's court session ended, Judge Tarnowski spoke to both legal teams. She said that because of today's evidence, they would meet again tomorrow morning to talk about changing the trial schedule and any motions either side wanted to file. Then she turned to the jury. "You are told again not to talk about this case with anyone, including each other, and to avoid any media coverage about this trial." As the courtroom began to empty, everyone felt the weight of what had been revealed. The recording, proven real and explained by an expert, had changed the trial from one of competing stories to something much more certain. Diddy's own words had shown what the prosecutors said from the start, that the accusations were not isolated events but part of a planned system that had gone on for decades. As Diddy was led out of the courtroom by his legal team, he kept his eyes on the floor, avoiding the looks of reporters, victims, and other people. The man who had built an empire on his charming public image now seemed unable to face anyone. The next morning, as the court got ready to meet again, everything had changed dramatically. News of the recording had dominated the headlines overnight, with legal experts saying it could end the case. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown, with both supporters and protesters holding signs and chanting. Security had been increased, creating a tense feeling even before the trial started again. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution team arrived early, looking quietly sure of themselves. The defense table stayed empty until just minutes before the session was set to begin. When Diddy walked in, he was surrounded by more lawyers than before, including two new well-known attorneys brought in overnight for crisis management. As Judge Tarnowski took the bench, she immediately spoke about what many had already noticed. She said she understood the defense wanted to make a statement before they continued. Diddy's lead attorney stood up. "Yes, Your Honor, after talking a lot with our client, we would like a short break to discuss a possible agreement with the prosecution." A murmur ran through the gallery. The judge raised an eyebrow but stayed calm. "Are you saying that Mr. Combe wants to change his plea?" "We are asking for time to talk about options with the prosecution, Your Honor." Judge Tarnowski turned to the prosecution. Does the government have a position on this request? The lead prosecutor stood. The government is always open to discussions, Your Honor, but given where we are in the trial and the evidence so far, any agreement must reflect how serious the charges are and how strong our case is. The judge thought for a moment. I will allow a 2-hour recess for these discussions. We will meet again at 11:30. She turned to the jury. Members of the jury, you are excused until 11:30 with the usual instructions to avoid media and not discuss the case. As the jury left the room, the courtroom filled with whispers. Reporters rushed out to announce that plea talks seemed to be happening. Diddy talked quietly with his lawyers, looking grim but resigned. When court started again at 11:30, the tension was strong. Judge Tarnowski called the court to order and spoke to the attorneys. Have the parties reached any agreement? The lead prosecutor stood. No, Your Honor. The government made an offer that we believe matches how serious the charges are and the evidence we have. The defense rejected that offer. Diddy's attorney confirmed, that is correct, Your Honor. The terms offered by the government are not acceptable to our client. We are ready to continue with the trial. The judge nodded. Very well, please bring in the jury. As the jury sat back down, many looked at Diddy curiously as if they wondered if they had missed something important. The prosecution called their next witness, Melissa Chen, a former assistant who worked for Diddy from 2012 to 2017. Chen, a calm woman in her 30s, took the stand and was sworn in. After saying where she worked, the prosecutor asked Miss Chen, have you had a chance to listen to the recording played in court yesterday? Yes, she replied. The FBI agents working on this case played it for me about 6 months ago. And what was your reaction to hearing that recording? Chen took a deep breath. I felt relief at first. Relief that someone had managed to record one of those conversations, because so many of us were told for years that no one would believe us without proof. Can you explain what you mean by those conversations? She explained how this was directly tied to the recording they heard. When Mr. Combs said, who is going to believe them, their word against mine, he was saying exactly why these systems keep going. Victims understand this reality. They have seen others try to speak out and be destroyed for it. Carrying such experiences without anyone believing you or seeing justice is a huge burden on the mind. Throughout this testimony, Diddy sat completely still. His earlier outburst had either used all his energy or been held back by his legal team's warnings. His attorneys took extensive notes but struggled to question an expert whose analysis perfectly matched their client's recorded words. When cross-examination finally began, the defense attorney was careful. He asked general questions about how reliable memory is and whether some relationships with big power imbalances can still be consensual. Dr. Montgomery admitted these issues were complex, but kept returning to the exact language from the recording. When someone clearly explains using substances to make people more flexible, preventing them from leaving events, and using career opportunities as both a reward and a threat, we are no longer in the realm of blurred power dynamics or consensual relationships. We are describing a system meant to destroy true consent. By the time Dr. Montgomery left the witness stand, her testimony had given the jury a clear framework for understanding both the recording and previous victim statements. What the defense tried to portray as misunderstandings, regretted decisions, or business arrangements became pieces of a sophisticated system of control and exploitation. In the gallery, several alleged victims who had already testified were visibly emotional. Some held hands or embraced as they finally heard an expert explain what they had struggled to describe. Reporters scribbled notes, already thinking of headlines about Diddy's system of control and how he maintained everyone's silence. As the day's proceedings came to a close, Judge Tarnowski spoke to both sides. In light of today's evidence, we will reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss any needed trial schedule changes and any motions either side wants to file. Then she turned to the jury. you are again instructed not to discuss this case with anyone, including each other, and to avoid any media coverage of this trial. As the courtroom cleared, the weight of the day's revelations hung in the air. The recording, proven authentic and explained by expert testimony, had shifted the trial from a case of competing stories to something far more definitive. Diddy's own words confirmed what prosecutors had argued from the start. The allegations were not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate, systematic operation that functioned for decades. When Diddy was led from the courtroom by his legal team, he kept his eyes on the floor, avoiding the gaze of reporters, victims, and spectators. The man who had built an empire on a charismatic public image now seemed unable to face anyone. The following morning, when court prepared to reconvene, the legal landscape had shifted dramatically. News of the recording had dominated headlines overnight, with legal analysts calling it potentially case-ending evidence. Outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled, with both supporters and protesters carrying signs and chanting. Security had been increased, creating a tense atmosphere before proceedings began. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution team arrived early, quietly confident. The defense table remained empty until just minutes before the scheduled start. When Diddy entered, flanked by an expanded legal team that now included 2 additional high-profile attorneys brought in overnight for crisis management, the tension was palpable. As Judge Tarnowski took the bench, she immediately addressed what many had already noticed. "I understand the defense wishes to make a statement before we proceed." Diddy's lead attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor. After extensive consultation with our client, we would like to request a brief recess to discuss a potential resolution with the prosecution." A murmur ran through the gallery. The judge raised an eyebrow but maintained her composure. "Are you indicating that Mr. Combe wishes to change his plea?" "We're requesting time to discuss our options with the prosecution, Your Honor." Judge Tarnowski turned to the prosecution table. "Does the government have a position on this request?" The lead prosecutor stood. "The government is always open to discussions, Your Honor, but given the stage of trial and the evidence presented so far, any resolution must appropriately reflect the seriousness of the charges and the strength of our case." The judge considered for a moment. "I'll grant a 2-hour recess for these discussions. We will reconvene at 11:30. She turned to the jury. "Members of the jury, you are excused until 11:30 with the usual admonitions about avoiding media and not discussing the case." As the jury filed out, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Reporters rushed from the room to break the news that plea negotiations seemed to be underway. Diddy conferred intensely with his legal team, his expression grim but resigned. When court reconvened at 11:30, the tension was thicker than ever. Judge Tarnowski called the court to order and addressed the attorneys. "Have the parties reached any agreement?" The lead prosecutor stood. "No, Your Honor. The government has made an offer that we believe appropriately reflects the seriousness of the charges and the evidence presented thus far." The defense rejected that offer. Diddy's attorney confirmed. "That's correct, Your Honor. The terms proposed by the government are unacceptable to our client. We are prepared to continue with trial." The judge nodded. "Very well, please bring in the jury." As the jury returned to their seats, many glanced at Diddy with curiosity, perhaps wondering if they had missed a significant development. The prosecution called their next witness, Melissa Chen, a former assistant who worked for Diddy from 2012 to 2017. Chen, a composed woman in her 30s, took the stand and was sworn in. After establishing her employment history, the prosecutor asked Ms. Chen, "Have you had an opportunity to listen to the recording that was played in court yesterday?" "Yes," she replied. "The FBI agents investigating this case played it for me about 6 months ago." "And what was your reaction to hearing that recording?" Chen took a deep breath, relief at first, relief that someone had managed to record one of those conversations, because so many of us had been told for years that no one would believe us without proof. "Can you elaborate on what you mean by those conversations?" the prosecutor asked. Mr. Combe was very open with his inner circle about how he operated. The language in that recording about consent being a contract, about having a system, about making and breaking people, I heard variations of those exact phrases dozens of times while I worked for him. The prosecutor displayed a series of emails on the courtroom screens. "Miss Chen, I'm showing you what has been marked as Exhibit 26. Can you identify these documents?" Chen examined the emails. "These are communications between me and other members of Mr. Combs' staff regarding what we called special events at his residences. And what was your role in relation to these special events?" the prosecutor asked. "I handled logistics, guest lists, catering, security arrangements, transportation. I was also responsible for ensuring all guests signed NDAs before attending and for collecting phones and other recording devices." The prosecutor highlighted specific language in the emails. "This message references the usual supplies. What did that mean?" Chen's voice remained steady, but her discomfort was visible. "That referred to various drugs, primarily MDMA, ketamine, and GHB, that were kept on hand at these events. There was also a reference to documentation supplies, which meant cameras and recording equipment set up in certain rooms. And what was the purpose of this recording equipment?" the prosecutor asked. "Mr. Combe told me it was insurance, his word. He said everyone needed to have something on everyone else. That's how he maintained control and ensured loyalty." As Chen continued her testimony, she described a system nearly identical to what had been heard in the recording, a carefully orchestrated operation designed to compromise, control, and silence victims. She explained how staff were compartmentalized into different teams, each handling separate parts of the operation, often without full knowledge of what the others were doing. "We were all implicated to some degree," she said. "Everyone had done something they could be blamed for if things went wrong. Everyone had something to lose if they spoke out." The prosecutor asked, "What made you decide to cooperate with the investigation?" Chen looked directly at Diddy for the first time. "I stayed quiet for years after I left. I had signed multiple NDAs and was terrified of retaliation. But when I saw the video of Mr. Combe assaulting his former girlfriend in that hotel hallway, something broke inside me. That could have been any of us. That could have been me. I contacted an attorney who put me in touch with the FBI. I didn't know if they would believe me without evidence, but I had to try. I couldn't be part of the silence anymore." The prosecutor then asked about specific victims who had testified earlier in the trial. Chen confirmed witnessing interactions that matched their accounts, describing how young women who arrived at events excited about career opportunities would leave looking traumatized and disoriented. There was a pattern, she explained. They would be separated from any friends they came with, introduced to Mr. Combe in a private setting, encouraged to drink or take substances, and then things would happen that they hadn't agreed to. Afterward, they'd be offered gifts, opportunities, connections, the contract he talked about in the recording. Throughout Chen's testimony, Diddy's demeanor continued to deteriorate. The confident, almost arrogant posture he had maintained through much of the trial was gone, replaced by a slumped posture and vacant stare. His attorneys repeatedly tried to engage him in whispered conversations, but he appeared disconnected, as if finally recognizing the inevitability of what was coming. During cross-examination, the defense tried to portray Chen as a disgruntled former employee with financial motives for testifying. She acknowledged being fired in 2017 but denied any financial incentive, pointing out that her cooperation had made her virtually unemployable in the entertainment industry. "I knew what would happen when I came forward," she stated firmly. "I've been blacklisted, threatened, and harassed, but I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent while other women continued to be hurt by this system." As Chen stepped down from the witness stand, the cumulative impact of the recording and her corroborating testimony had created a narrative that was becoming increasingly difficult for the defense to counter. The jury, many of whom had been taking extensive notes, appeared visibly affected by what they had heard. The prosecution announced their next witness, Dr. James Wilson, a toxicologist who had analyzed samples from several alleged victims tested within 24 hours of attending events at Diddy's residences. Dr. Wilson's testimony was clinical but devastating. He explained finding GHB, ketamine, and MDMA, often in combinations that cause disorientation, memory gaps, and increased suggestibility, while leaving victims conscious enough to participate in activities they might not otherwise consent to. These substances, particularly when combined, create a state where someone appears conscious and responsive but lacks the capacity for true consent. Moreover, they cause antegrade amnesia, preventing victims from forming new memories, which means they may only have fragmentary recollections of what occurred. The prosecutor connected this testimony directly back to the recording where Diddy had mentioned the right substances to make people more flexible. Dr. Wilson confirmed that the drugs found in the victims' systems would create exactly the compromised consent that Diddy had described. The judge called for a brief recess before the next witness. As the courtroom began to clear, Diddy remained seated, staring straight ahead, the weight of his own words pressing down on him. The man who had once declared himself untouchable had just provided the final piece of evidence against himself. When Sean Diddy Combs stepped down from the witness stand, he didn't look like someone who had won anything. He looked like someone who had finally confronted the reality of his own actions. The courtroom stayed unnaturally quiet, processing the turn of events. Even the judge seemed slightly stunned by the effective confession they had just witnessed. Some jurors had tears in their eyes. Outside the courtroom, the world was only beginning to react. The music industry went into full crisis mode on the record. Labels issued statements distancing themselves from Diddy and announcing reviews of harassment policies. Artists who had collaborated with him over decades scrambled to express shock and condemnation. Associates who had once benefited from his power and influence now claimed they had always had concerns about his behavior. Behind closed doors, crisis meetings were convened at entertainment companies across Los Angeles and New York. PR firms circulated guidance on how clients should respond to questions about their relationships with Diddy, and while many pretended to be blindsided, the internet connected dots visible for years. Old interviews resurfaced, showing insiders joking about Diddy's parties with knowing looks. Photos of visibly uncomfortable women at his events circulated with new context, and previous accusations, once dismissed as extortion, were now re-examined with new credibility. Fans were not just shocked, they were furious that someone they had admired abused his power so systematically, furious that the industry protected him for decades, and furious that it took this long for victims to be believed. The era of impunity was over. The next morning, a palpable shift had occurred in the courtroom. News outlets reported sources close to the defense team saying Diddy was considering changing his plea. Legal analysts speculated the recording had made a successful defense virtually impossible. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with spectators lined up outside hoping for a seat. As Judge Tarnowski took the bench, she addressed an immediate matter. I understand the defense has a motion to present before we continue with testimony. Diddy's lead attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor. After consulting with our client, we request permission for Mr. Combs to address the court directly. The request was unusual at this stage of a trial. The prosecutor objected immediately. Your Honor, if the defendant wishes to speak, the proper procedure is to take the witness stand where he can be cross-examined. This appears to be an attempt to communicate with the jury without subjecting himself to questioning. Judge Tarnowski considered the request carefully. What is the specific purpose of Mr. Combs' proposed statement? Your Honor, my client wishes to respond to the recording that was played for the jury and provide necessary context he believes is missing. The judge turned to Diddy. Mr. Combe, are you prepared to take the witness stand and be subject to cross-examination regarding your statement and all other matters relevant to this case? A tense silence filled the courtroom as Diddy conferred briefly with his attorneys. Finally, he stood. Yes, Your Honor, I'll take the stand. The decision sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Until this moment, it was widely assumed Diddy would not testify, a standard strategy in criminal cases where the defendant's testimony risks creating additional vulnerability. His decision to take the stand signaled either a desperate gamble or a recognition that the case was already lost. After being sworn in, Diddy took the witness stand. Gone was the designer suit and confident demeanor that had characterized his court appearances. Instead, he wore a simple navy suit. His posture was humbled, his voice subdued. His attorney began with a simple question. Mr. Combe, we've all heard the recording that was played in court. What context do you believe is missing from that conversation? Diddy cleared his throat. First, I want to acknowledge that my words on that recording are indefensible. There's no context that makes them acceptable. I was arrogant, callous, and wrong. The courtroom stirred at this unexpected opening. His attorney seemed momentarily thrown but recovered. Can you explain to the jury what state of mind you were in during that conversation? I was intoxicated, Diddy replied, not just with alcohol and drugs, but with power. I'd spent decades surrounded by people who catered to my every whim, who told me I was untouchable, who cleaned up my messes. I started to believe I was above the rules that apply to everyone else. His attorney guided him through questions about his career, his rise to fame, and the music empire he had built. Diddy spoke about growing up without a father, his drive to succeed, and the legitimate aspects of his business ventures. But rather than offering these as excuses, he repeatedly returned to how success had corrupted him. I confused power with the right to exercise that power over others, he said. When asked directly about the allegations of sex trafficking and racketeering, Diddy's response was carefully crafted but damning nonetheless. I created a culture where lines were constantly crossed, where consent was compromised, where silence was purchased. I didn't call it trafficking or racketeering. I called it business. I called it parties. I called it networking. But labels don't change what it was. His attorney, navigating unfamiliar territory with a client who was not following the expected defense strategy, asked about specific victims who had testified. I don't dispute their accounts, Diddy responded. For years, I told myself their experiences were different from how they remembered them. That recording showed exactly how I rationalized my behavior by convincing myself that power and opportunity were fair trades for the things I demanded. As direct examination continued, it became clear Diddy was not mounting a traditional defense, but instead offering what appeared to be a confession wrapped in context and personal history. Whether this was a strategic attempt to mitigate sentencing or a genuine moment of reckoning remained unclear. The real test came during cross-examination. The lead prosecutor approached the witness stand with a thick binder of evidence. Mr. Combe, you've presented yourself today as someone who has had a revelation about your past behavior. Is that accurate? Yes, Diddy replied. And when exactly did this revelation occur? Was it perhaps yesterday after the jury heard you in your own words describing a system of exploitation and control? After your own former employees corroborated everything in that recording? It's been a process, Diddy replied, his composure slipping, but yes, hearing that recording played in court was clarifying. Hearing myself say those things, seeing the reactions of the jury, the public, even my own family, I couldn't hide from it anymore. The prosecutor nodded. So, not during the decades you engaged in this behavior, not when victims came forward with lawsuits, not when you were arrested and charged, but only yesterday when you realized the jury had heard irrefutable evidence of your guilt? Objection, Diddy's attorney called out. Argumentative, sustained, the judge ruled. Rephrase, counsel. The prosecutor adjusted, but continued pressing Diddy on the timing and sincerity of his apparent remorse. She walked him through specific allegations from victims as asking him to confirm or deny each one. Diddy largely confirmed the accounts, sometimes adding that his memory of events was compromised by his own substance use at the time. The most powerful moment came when the prosecutor asked about a specific line from the recording. "You said, and who's going to believe them, their word against mine. Is that correct?" "Yes," Diddy admitted. And that idea that nobody would believe your victims because of your power, wealth, and influence, that was central to how you operated for decades, wasn't it? Diddy paused, then nodded slowly. "Yes. So all those women who came forward over the years who were dismissed as gold diggers, opportunists, or liars, you knew they were telling the truth, didn't you?" "Objection, Your Honor, counsel is testifying." "I'll rephrase," the prosecutor said before the judge could rule. "Mr. Combe, when previous accusers came forward with stories similar to what we've heard in this trial, did you know they were telling the truth about their experiences?" Diddy looked down at his hands. "Yes." "And did you participate in efforts to discredit them, to portray them as liars seeking money?" "Yes." "Did you authorize payments to silence them?" "Yes." "Did you threaten their careers if they didn't accept those payments and sign NDAs?" "In some cases, yes." As cross-examination continued, Diddy's composure gradually eroded. The prosecutor methodically walked him through each criminal charge's elements, effectively extracting admissions that match the definitions of sex trafficking, racketeering, and the other counts he faced. By the time cross-examination concluded, Diddy appeared exhausted and defeated. His testimony, instead of mitigating the damage from the recording, had cemented the prosecution's case in many respects. As he stepped down from the witness stand, he paused, looking around the courtroom filled with reporters, victims, curious spectators, and family members. For a moment, it seemed he might say something more, but instead, he simply returned to the defense table in silence. For the first time since his arrest, Diddy looked like a man who had accepted that his end had come. He didn't speak to his attorneys when he returned to the defense table. He didn't write notes or whisper strategies. He sat motionless, eyes fixed on the empty witness stand he had just vacated, as if still seeing a ghost of his former self there, the man who had believed in his own impunity. When asked later by reporters if Diddy's testimony had been a strategic move, his lead attorney reportedly replied, "Sometimes the truth is the only strategy left." When court reconvened the following day, the defense team made a stunning announcement. Diddy wished to change his plea to guilty on all counts. The prosecution, after consulting victims, agreed to the plea change but made clear they would seek the maximum sentences allowed by law. Judge Tarnowski addressed Diddy directly, conducting a thorough plea colloquy to ensure he understood the rights he was giving up and the possible sentences he faced. When asked if anyone had coerced him into changing his plea, Diddy shook his head. "No, Your Honor, I'm pleading guilty because I am guilty. I've caused tremendous harm to many people over many years. I can't change that, but I can at least acknowledge it and accept the consequences." The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, remanding Diddy to custody pending that hearing. As he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, several victims who had testified during the trial watched in silence, some holding hands, others wiping away tears. The man who had seemed untouchable was finally facing justice. In the weeks that followed, the repercussions extended far beyond Diddy himself. Multiple investigations were launched into industry practices that had enabled such behavior. Other powerful figures in entertainment faced renewed scrutiny about their conduct. Victims of similar abuse in the industry began coming forward in unprecedented numbers, many citing the Diddy case as giving them the courage to speak. The recording that broke the case open, those 9 minutes of unguarded conversation that shattered Diddy's carefully constructed defense, became the centerpiece of documentaries, podcasts, and academic studies on power, abuse, and accountability in entertainment. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later, several victims delivered powerful impact statements. One woman who had first met Diddy as an aspiring singer at 19 addressed him directly. "You stole my dreams, my confidence, and years of my life. But today, watching you face consequences that your money and fame couldn't prevent gives me back something you took. It gives me hope that things can change." Diddy was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison on the most serious charges, with additional sentences to run concurrently. As the judge delivered the sentence, she noted, "The harm you caused was not accidental or isolated. By your own admission, it was systematic, deliberate, and sustained over decades." The sentence reflects not just the gravity of the crimes, but the scope and duration of the damage inflicted. When he was led from the courtroom for the final time, Diddy looked nothing like the music mogul who once graced magazine covers and commanded industry respect. He looked like what the court had determined him to be, a criminal who used his power to victimize others for decades, now finally held accountable. Outside the courthouse, one of the lead prosecutors made a brief statement. "Today's outcome sends a message that should have been clear all along. No one is above the law. No amount of money, fame, or power places you beyond accountability, and no victim's voice is too small to be heard." The case went on to inspire significant legal and cultural changes. California and New York passed laws limiting non-disclosure agreements in cases involving alleged sexual misconduct. The recording industry established new oversight mechanisms and support systems for young artists. Victims advocacy groups reported unprecedented outreach from people in entertainment and other industries dominated by powerful gatekeepers. But perhaps the most profound impact was simpler. It showed that even decades of silence can be broken by the truth captured in 9 minutes of unguarded conversation when a powerful man revealed who he really was. If you found this story informative, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you in-depth coverage of important stories that others might miss. Your support helps us continue this work. Thanks for watching.